Joel, was Emmanuel a Messiah? Is that prophecy, whether you call it a virgin or a young woman or whoever conceives, is that about the birth of the Messiah?
Well, at this point, I think it's hard to talk about the Messiah in that way, but it kind of depends what you mean by the word Messiah, John.
Yeah, well, you see, what Messiah means, and you got the word in Psalm 2, which is very relevant to what we're talking about here, where God puts his king on Zion, his holy mountain, and tells him, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." But what it says, he says to his anointed one. Now, that's Mashiach, his Messiah, if you like. And all Messiah means in this case is the anointed one of the Lord.
Right.
So really all you could ask in the case of Emmanuel is he likely to have been the heir to the throne? And we're not sure, but quite possibly. But it does not mean Messiah in the sense the word would later come to mean, of somebody who would bring lasting salvation.
Right. The notion of Messiah with any meaning other than simply the anointed person is a considerably later development. I mean, it is, I think, in the Hebrew Bible that we start to see that, but it's not here.
It's not here in chapter 7, at any rate. Now, we have two other passages that are often regarded as messianic here, both of them famous passages, especially in Christian contexts.
Right.
In chapter 9 and chapter 11.
Right. My general rule with is if you can hear Handel playing in the background when you're reading, you know you've come across one of these of these passages in Isaiah.
So, unto us a child is born.
That's right. Exactly.
Here you
His
have
name shall be called. Exactly.
Classic one. Now, the lead into it in chapter 9, there will be no gloom for those who were in anguish. In the former time he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun, the land of Naphtali, Galilee of the nations. And now the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Now, the historical context, I think, of what is going on there is it's after one of the Assyrian incursions into the north. Mm-hmm. Now, it could have been back in the 730s when they did some damage and then withdrew. It could also be after the actual destruction of Samaria. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things that it mentions here is that you have multiplied the nation. And one of the archaeological discoveries of recent times is that the size of Jerusalem greatly increased.
Yeah.
After the destruction of Samaria.
Yeah, almost doubled. Just a huge population growth.
And most probably because of people fleeing south.
Sure.
So, there's a good side to that too.
Right. I mean, this is a huge moment for the Bible. Actually, is when the North, what's left of the North comes south. We suddenly have the melding of traditions that had previously been independent, and
this is how Judah becomes Israel.
Yeah.
Which is kind of the image that we have that survives from the Bible. Now, then. Unto us a child is born, a child has been born to us, a son is given to us. Is this likely to be actually about the birth of a child?
Well, if they're talking about Hezekiah, but we just had the prophecy of Hezekiah's birth, so maybe they are talking about the birth of a child. But you mentioned Psalm 2, right, where we've got language of being born, but probably not actually about the birth of a child. There's another way of thinking about it.
Right. In Psalm 2, it's God says to the king, "You are my son, today I have begotten you."
Says not to the infant king,
but to the adult king. It's speaking to an adult.
Yeah.
So it's enthronement is what you're talking about. Now, it's a famous article on this by Gerhard von Rad about 80 years ago in which he pointed out the similarity to some of the Egyptian enthronement rituals. Now, Egypt had ruled Jerusalem back in the second millennium, And even at the time when David conquered the city, it was still in the hands of the Jebusites, supposedly, who may have retained a certain amount of this Egyptian royal ideology. But I think it's certainly true in the Psalms that the king is not regarded as just a regular human being. He is, in some sense, a god. Now, maybe not quite as exalted a sense as it was in Egypt, but still, he is the Son of God. He has some special, and this really is not, has nothing to do with how he was born.
Right.
It has to do with the relationship, the esteem in which God holds him.
Right.
But they do speak of it of begetting rather than of adopting.
Right. So what we're talking about then, to be clear, is an adult, probably Hezekiah, who is the Messiah, Son of God.
Yes. He's the Messiah, Son of God.
You can see how Christians would have read this differently.
Well, yes. And, I mean, Christians were not misreading it insofar as they saw this as being about the Messiah, Son of God.
Right.
But they had a very different understanding of what that meant
Right.
from what anybody would have meant in the time of Isaiah. But now it's the new king coming to the throne. And when the new king comes to the throne, all things are possible. And so you get this litany of names by which he is to be called. Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, El Gibor.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a bit much, especially if you were talking about a child. But still, I mean, these, I think, are the honorary titles that are given to the king. And it's even Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. His authority shall grow continually, and there shall be endless peace for the throne of David and his kingdom. He will establish and uphold it with justice and righteousness from this time forth and forevermore.
Right. So it's so interesting because all the language is language that would come to be associated with God, or that had already been associated with God. But much of it in God's role as king, right? The one who is responsible for the well-being of the nation, the one who upholds justice, right? These are all royal roles.
That's right.
That earlier Israelite thought had attributed upward to the deity, right? The God, we said this earlier, right? God is like a human king, just better. These are royal roles that we attributed to God that then sort of became God's roles, and so were difficult to understand, I think, for interpreters as referring simply to a human. But it ties in with what we had mentioned earlier, which is the notion of the house of David being special.
And it's also, all the kings in the ancient Near East used language much like this,
Sure.
to varying degrees. Hammurabi, stood for righteousness and justice.
Sure.
Well, what he actually did in practice, who knows? But at least every self-respecting king claimed to be the one who upheld justice and righteousness and peace.
Right.
Even while he was waging war.
Right. Cyrus.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's royal ideology is what you're having here. The idea that it'll be from this time forth and forevermore is sheer hyperbole. But it's the rulers have been known to engage in hyperbole. It occasionally happens still.
Yeah.
And this was an occasion for it.
And it fits, right? The notion of forevermore fits with what I think at this point was a fairly well-established, again, notion of David's line as going to continue. It wasn't around for so long, but compared to the rest of the kings and dynasties of the time and place, David's lineage actually lasted a remarkably long time.
It did. It lasted about 400 years or something like that.
I mean, the northern kingdom of Israel had nothing remotely close.
That's forever.
Exactly.
we take it.
I mean, imagine, it's hard for us to think, but today we look back and it's not so long, but it's longer than America has been around. Imagine if we had imagine if we still had President Washington the 45th or whatever it would be.
Or imagine if we had Donald Trump for the next 400 years.
Let's not.
Yeah. Move on to chapter 11, where you have another of these messianic prophecies. Now, you see, is that one in chapter 9 messianic? Well, in a sense it is. I mean, it's describing the reign of an ideal king. Mm-hmm. Where it differs from the later Christian idea of a Messiah is the same king isn't expected to live forever. Right. It's the dynasty that is supposed to last. Right. That's what it's about. Now, in chapter 11, you also have an ideal king. In this case, a shoot shall come from the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow from his roots. We talked already about this image of the stump.
Yeah.
So, one of the first questions about this is this presupposing that the tree has been cut down?
By which you mean, is it written after the tree has already, the dynasty has ended, or is it simply foreseeing the dynasty might end?
Yeah, I mean, there are various possibilities. Mm-hmm. I mean, even if you say that it has been reduced to a stump, I mean, you could say that after Sennacherib passed through, we'll talk more about Sennacherib in some of the other passages, but where only Jerusalem was left.
Yeah.
That could have been. Another date that's been proposed is the time of Josiah. This is the king who had the Deuteronomic reform because his father was murdered. Mm-hmm. So, cut down.
That would be a much later addition to the book. That's the end of the 7th century.
And then a lot of people would say that it presupposes the Babylonian exile, where the whole dynasty was cut down.
I think given the way that Isaiah uses the image elsewhere, right, which is almost complete destruction, but still a possibility of continuity, we don't actually need it to have fully ended.
Right.
Right, which may be a problem of translation. It may be a problem with our word stump, right, which we think of as, right, like kind of nothing's going to grow there anymore. It's going to remain as, it would be miraculous for something to grow out of a stump. I'm not entirely sure that that's necessarily the way that they would have used the word.
Certainly they don't think that a stump is something from which nothing grows anymore. That go against the whole point of the passage. But I do think it has the image of a tree has been cut down. But what would be necessary to say that? It doesn't have to be the whole destruction of the dynasty.
Agreed.
And I think the pattern of the prophecy is very much in line with what I take to be the pattern of Isaiah's prophecy. And that is to say, you're going to be destroyed to within an inch of your life, but you'll come back.
Right. What more can we say then about sort of Isaiah in this time of intense sort of international threat, having prophecies that do seem to be, optimistic in the long run?
Yeah.
I mean, was he advocating for? Is he advocating for? I mean, we think of prophets as sort of wanting people to change, right? Repent, do something, right? Make some change to your behavior to be what God wants. I'm not entirely sure that that's really, at least on the surface of what Isaiah is doing here. Right? When Isaiah says it's all going to be destroyed, but is anybody supposed to be doing anything different, or are we just supposed to say, I guess that's the way it is?
Well, there are passages, and we'll come to one of them in the next section, where he criticizes current behavior. Say, those who join house to house and field to field. And presumably, he wants them to change that. Mm-hmm. But as far as the survival of the nation as a whole goes, I think there's a fair case to be made that things are going to happen no matter what. And that what he is trying to do is explain to them that it will happen, and so hang in there. I think he is calling for trust. He does seem to be, to a degree, an apologist for the Davidic house. Mm-hmm. He seems to accept the idea that God has chosen the Davidic house and that one should trust in that. I think where he's different from what a lot of people tend to make him out to be is that that's not going to be easy.
Right.
No, it's not a blanket endorsement. You'll still go through hell along the way.
Right. So in our next segment, we're going to back up actually and talk about some of those more social justice kinds of prophecies from the very beginning of the book.
Yes, and see what the editors of the book actually put at the beginning of the book.
Exactly.